Welcome back once again, friends. As you know, we have been building the secret messages project, and as part of that, we have built a function which allows us to swap the even and odd letters of a given string. And that's how we can create an interesting secret message. Now, when we built this function, we encountered a statement called the return statement. And at that point, I said that we are going to look at this a little bit later in more detail. So in this video, I'm going to talk a lot about this return statement. We're going to understand it in detail because this is very, very important. It allows us to think carefully about how our Python code runs, how exactly the execution happens, and so on. So let's get started. We remember use the return statement inside a function. So we had a function called even odd swap with the input of x. We did some processing on x. We created a new string called s. We populated that string, and then finally we had a statement called return s. Now, at this point, I want you to notice a few things. Number one, that return right now is in fact the last statement of this function. And how do I know it's last statement? Because notice that post this statement, I have no longer got the indentation. These two are blank lines, and these two I have not got the indentation, and hence I have in fact ended the function over here, which means the return is indeed the last statement. But as we'll see later, this is not mandatory. In fact, we can have return, it need not be the last statement of the given function. However, this is what it is right now. Now, the question that comes up is, what do you think? What does the return really mean? So let's think about it, right? In English, return means to go back, right? So the same logic applies here. However, the question is, where does it go back to? In fact, the answer is quite simple. The execution goes back to wherever it was called from. Let's see this more carefully through an illustration that I've created. If I go in here, remember, I have got my code here. In the beginning, I define this function even or swap. The first few lines until this indentation gets over are dedicated to this function definition. And indeed, I must define this before I actually call this function. However, remember and notice that definition alone is just like telling what the function does, but it does not actually run it. It's like in Scratch, we create a my block, we define the my block, but unless the code is run, that my block is just a definition. In the same way, right now it's just a definition, which means that even though my statement here, X Python is cool, is say line number 18 or line number 19, the execution actually starts over here, right? So this is an important point. My code starts to run from here because before this is all definition. And in fact, it's a good practice to put the code definitions, the function definitions in the beginning so that we know how the code is going to behave, right? When these functions are called. So now my code execution starts here. Remember, the code goes from top to bottom. So the next line that is done is this line, right? So I'm going to use this blue arrow to tell how the execution, how the running of this code is actually going on. First, this line is run, a string X is created, which is Python is cool. Next, I go to the next line where my interpreter recognizes that I am getting a function call, and it knows that this function has been defined, which means it knows what to do with this. However, that also means that the execution is going to go and shift from this line to say kind of inside the function, right? So I'm going to pass in this input X, and then I'm going to basically execute all these commands here. And by execution, I mean all these commands are going to run. Of course, over here, there's a loop, which means there'll be a little bit of looping going on here. But nonetheless, the idea is that I'm going to run all these statements, including creating this S, until I run into this statement called return. Remember, I'm going from top to bottom. At some point, I'll come and hit this return statement. At this point, I'm telling this Python code that, okay, look, please take the execution back to wherever you came from, and hence it will come back to this line again. So what's going to happen is that this function is going to take an input of X. It's going to do some processing, return me back an output of S, and that S I'm going to assign to whatever is this variable, right? That's why this variable ends up having, the value that is returned from the function, and my execution can now continue. Now, I hope this illustration makes it a bit clear. As I said, return is taking this execution back to wherever the function was called from. We'll see this in more detail, but let's look at a few points about the return statement. First and foremost, return statements can only be used inside functions. Now, be careful on this. Return has to be used only inside functions. And remember, being inside and outside a function is a matter of indentation, which means that if you're not indented your code correctly, you may have problems. The function, return statement may end up being outside, right? So be careful with this. Return can only be used inside, and inside outside, like I said, is a matter of indentation. Next, and we have already seen this, it is not mandatory for functions to have a return statement, right? We have seen this, for example, in the pixel art project where we did not have any return statement and the functions just worked fine, right? So execution went to the function. Once it got over, it anyway returned back to wherever it has been called from, right? And we have already seen this in the pixel art, right? However, there are two very specific situations where a return is indeed needed. And one of those two situations is what we are encountering here. First situation is that when we want the function to return some value. Okay, now this brings out a very interesting viewpoint, a very powerful viewpoint, I would say, where we can think of a function, like I said, like a process where I'm giving some input, the function is doing something, and then it's generating an output for me. For example, in this particular scenario, I'm giving a string as an input. The function is flipping the even and odd places and then giving me back an output. In this scenario, for me to use, for me to be basically able to, let's say, use this output, I'll have to use a return statement. So for example, I'm saying returning s is my output, and by doing x even odd equals to even odd swap x, I'm assigning this s into the variable even x even odd. Remember, whatever was happening in here was local to the function. So now that function is returning s, I'm supplying this back to this variable here. Now, this viewpoint is actually quite powerful, quite interesting, because there will be situations in future, or as you write more and more code, where sometimes you may not exactly know what is going on. Rather, let's say how this function is processing, right? But you know what the function does. So, for example, you know that if I give this input, I'm going to get this output no matter how this is happening, right? So I can kind of treat this as a black box sometimes, and I can still use a function, which is why this viewpoint is in fact quite powerful. Of using functions will allow you to write, build more and more code as you go forward. However, there's also a second use case where return is needed, which is that sometimes you want the execution to return to the caller before the function has been completely, before the function is completely over. Recall here, I told you return is the last statement, but in fact, and you'll see this later, sometimes there are situations where the function runs, perhaps at this point itself, you wanted to return for some reason, maybe under some circumstances, you wanted this point itself to return. So you could have put a return over here, and then the execution will just return, right? So remember, I told you that return need not be the last statement, but sometimes when you want it to return prematurely, you can also use this return statement. I hope this makes it clear. Now, a question that might be still in your head is that sometimes a function might call another function, right? We have seen this just like my blocks in Scratch. A my block can use other my blocks as well, which means a function can also use other functions, and we have already seen that in the pixel art project. What happens in that case, and how does the return statement work out? So I've created a sort of animation for you again, just to make you a little bit aware of what's going on. Let's say there is this main code. Now there is really, this main code is somewhat notional here. There's nothing like we're not defining a function or something like that, which is main. Here, just main code, like for example, x equals to pi, in the previous example, x equals to Python school was sort of the main code, and my execution starts here. So what will happen is that my execution will start going line by line. Perhaps at some line, I go and say encounter function 1. Now remember, at this point, the execution will shift to function 1. I will go into function 1 and I'll start executing again line by line till I reach, say, a function 2. Remember, this is function 1 calling function 2. Again, because it sees function 2, execution is going to shift into function 2. So it's going to come in here, run until the return statement. At this point, remember, I must go back to where I was called from, and function 2 was called from function 1, right? Which means that I will go back to function 2 and I will continue to run until I see a return statement again, and return statement will take me back to where this function 1 was called from. In this case, say this code, and I come back here and then I'll keep on running, right? So that's how the code runs. Like I said, this is quite powerful because it's giving control on how the code actually flows. I hope this is a lot more clearer over now. Make sure you spend time thinking about this. Like I said, if you want to return a value from the function, or you want to prematurely end the function, then you must use return statements, and return takes you back to the calling place. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.